thank you, the organizers of the Convoco Forum. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak to you today. Blockchains are a transformational technology for the world. It's a general purpose technology that's going to completely insinuate itself into all facets of our society over the next 30 years. And it represents the next wave of digitization that will fundamentally alter our relationship with anything of value. It will have similar, if not greater, impact on the world as the internet has. And why is this? It's because blockchains allow for the digitization of value. The internet helped to drive digitization of the world's knowledge and freed it to be shared and searched by anybody on Earth. It helped to spawn billion-dollar companies that we all know and use, household names such as Google, Amazon, Facebook, Google, and others. And it gave traditionally powerless the ability to express their complaints and discontentments. It helped to make the powerful even more connected to the global community. And we rely so heavily on the internet now that having access to the internet is like having access to air and water almost. When we don't have it, we feel lost and disconnected. Don Tapscott, a futurist and the author of Blockchain Revolution, says, "The internet of everything needs a ledger of everything." The blockchain is a truly open, distributed, global platform that fundamentally changes what we can do online, how we do it, and who can participate. Call it the worldwide ledger. So just as the internet allowed the digitization of information and knowledge, blockchains allow the digitization of value, land titles, intellectual property, securities, energy. Just as if the internet impacted $1 trillion worth of value, mainly in the information sector, blockchains are going to impact 100 trillion in value. Physical, digital, and business processes. So it probably helps if I pick a couple of examples to illustrate. And I'll take land, intellectual property, and the Internet of Things. First, land. So blockchains could allow people to safely and securely hold title to their land and property outside of the reach of corrupt officials. In many countries without functioning land title registries, this could be a godsend to the hundreds of million people around the world who live day-to-day, hand-to-mouth. Hernando de Soto, a Peruvian economist, wrote a seminal book, The Mystery of Capital, asking the question, why do people remain poor? And it's because they don't have title to their land. When people have title, they can start businesses, they can invest more into their homes and communities, they can pay taxes, and they can get loans. And the police and the justice systems protect their rights, things that we take for granted, but make a world of difference. And society works better when citizens have more options. And blockchains can be an underlying technology to enable this. Second, intellectual property. Blockchains allow for new business models for the internet, models that don't rely on companies sucking up our personal data and serving us ads. They allow for creatives to claim authorship and copyright for their intellectual property in a global registry that anyone can access and view. And when people are given the keys to their intellectual property, they can transfer usage rights, creating new ways to sell their work anywhere on Earth without borders. And third, the Internet of Things. Blockchains enable the Internet of Things. You've all kind of heard of this thing, and how is that? Well, one of the biggest challenges that we haven't solved is micropayments. Payments so small that the cost of transaction are greater than the cost of the value that's being transferred. We need to solve micropayments to enable the Internet of Things to work because billions of transactions, each worth a millionth of a cent, are exchanged. And when 100 billion devices are talking to one another, exchanging data, energy, and value, this is a deceptively complicated problem that blockchains can help to solve because they bring transaction costs close to zero. They can allow machine-to-machine communication, value exchange, and then the reconciliation of all those value transfers at a very, very low cost. When blockchains can be deployed for the Internet of Things, you can have things like charging stations for your electric car that are completely independent. You can have power generation from rooftop panels that can be bought and traded in real time. You can have manufacturing where you could send off a design to some factory halfway around the world and know that that intellectual property is protected and the payment is seamless. There are countless applications. And just these three examples, land title, intellectual property, the Internet of Things, are only a small subset of the use cases that we've seen in the last year. And make no mistake, the pace of innovation in deploying this blockchain technology is going at 5 times the rate of the speed of the development of the Internet. We're essentially at 1993 if we're comparing the blockchain world now to the Internet, before Windows 95, before Internet Explorer, before Amazon. And unlike 1993, where the media industry and governments got caught flat-footed and were almost destroyed by the disruption reaped by the Internet, now we have $100 trillion of value at stake in blockchain. And you can bet that the world's banks, insurance companies, lawyers, trading houses, energy firms are not going to be caught off guard so easily. There is a groundswell of research and activity going on throughout the world in all sectors to deploy blockchain solutions and develop business models to allow this value to flow seamlessly across the world, just as information does today. So I have strong confidence that big business is going to be fine. And the title of this forum is Authority in Question. What about government? How much government corruption is hidden away because people don't have transparency of data? What waste could be lost in contracts and procurement to bribes and filling the pockets of corrupt officials in other countries, potentially? And how many processes are suboptimal because the system isn't seen as a whole? It hasn't touched the digital age. Hernando de Soto, the economist I mentioned, found that it took on average 278 days to start a business in Peru, 3/4 of a year, 8 hours a day, with 11 permits from 7 ministries and 10 bribes. In Egypt, it's even worse. It takes 550 days to open a bakery. And when you multiply this administration across the daily needs of society in all these countries around the world, it's a huge ballast on productivity, innovation, and it holds back human development. These are extreme examples, naturally. But just as blockchains enable completely new and novel ways to transact and share value, they represent a risk for government. If we have an internet for information that is global and borderless, that we do today, what happens when we have an internet of value that is also global and borderless? How can governments track the flow of goods and ownership if it can be transferred within seconds around the globe? How does that impact the collection of taxes, the enforcement of sanctions, the interdiction of prohibited goods? We already have global corporations that have the reach and the power of governments. Will blockchains further strengthen the power of corporates and reduce the influence of governments even more? And faced with these challenges, how do governments change their institutions, many built over decades, to move at the pace of digital? Is digitization finally attacking the institutions that are meant to bring stability and continuity for our society and protect the people? I believe that blockchain technology can be used to make good governments even better, and by default, highlight bad governments. You see experimentation and openness in places like Switzerland, Singapore, Canada, Estonia, the United Kingdom, places that are known for being good governments. And they are seeking pragmatic ways to engage with this technology and deploy it as early as possible. And I believe that the nations that embrace blockchain into their government services can enable thriving ecosystems of innovation in their economy, in their society, and in their government. And we've already seen the lion's share of investment and innovation happening in these very locations. The future billion-dollar startups will most likely come from these countries and in the blockchain space. So in closing, blockchain is a profound technology that's going to be used for very productive and disruptive ends to change the way we interact with value across all sectors of industry and society and government. And over the next 30 years, we can expect that it will become like the other general purpose technologies, electricity, computers, and the internet, where it will become an integral part of the fabric of our lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce, for a great introduction on blockchain technology, and I'm sure you will agree with me. After these 10 minutes, we have learned quite a bit about blockchain technology, and Bruce also touched upon the potential application of such technology and how that would impact our world of finance and the world of politics. So today, we are very fortunate to have 3 experts with us on our panel. If you could join me in welcoming them on the stage first, and then I'll do the introduction one by one. Please, Garrick, Marcella, and Julie. Right, okay. If I can start from my very far left, we have Ms. Marcella Astori, who is a political analyst, an academic researcher, and also with a heavy focus on blockchain technology. And very recently, she has joined the Research Center for Blockchain Technology at University College of London. And sitting to the right of Marcella, we have Julie Maupin, if my French is correct. She's a senior research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law, as well as a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Julie is also an economist as well as a lawyer with specialty lies in public and private rights. And last but not least, we have Garrick. Garrick Hyman, who is a senior research associate at the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance, as well as a researcher at the LSE Center for Macroeconomics. Away from his academic activities, Gary has also co-founded a San Francisco-based tech incubator, IT strategy consulting for multinationals, as well as founded the Micro Digest. So that's our 3 panelists today, and I can't wait to dive into the topic of blockchain technology. But before we dive into this exciting topic, if I can take a step back, just thinking about 8 years ago in the year of 2008, to most people, Lehman Brothers collapse will say, you know, that's the event of the year. But most people did not know what happened 6 weeks after that. And that is why we are sitting here today talking about blockchain technology. So Gary, would you mind just give us a quick introduction about why we are talking about blockchain technology and what really happened in the year of 2008?
Well, I think Lehman Brothers certainly was quite significant along with the other events of the financial crisis. But on Halloween, the 31st of October of 2008, just a few weeks after Lehman failed, a paper was published to a rather obscure cryptography website mailing list by someone named Satoshi Nakamoto. No one had really ever heard of this Satoshi Nakamoto, and the paper described it was called Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer kind of electronic cash system. And the paper went through kind of the technology of making a decentralized currency work. What does that term decentralized mean? I think it's important to kind of talk about that. It means that there's no central server or institution like a bank that is necessary for people to send value from one person to another. Okay? It's all operated through a peer-to-peer network of computers. This was quite revolutionary. So people had been working on cryptocurrency for many, many years before this. In fact, it's important that you understand that the technology that was necessary to create Bitcoin all existed roughly 10 years before 2008. The genius of Satoshi Nakamoto was really to synthesize things like peer-to-peer networking and proof of work and some of these other pieces into an integrated system. But Bitcoin could have been invented 10 years earlier. In fact, the history of cryptocurrency goes back into the early 1980s when David Chaum wrote his seminal paper. David Chaum was part of a group of people called the cypherpunks who worked on not just cryptocurrency, the idea of being able to transact anonymously, but also to communicate anonymously. That was a big part of why these cypherpunks, who were largely in the Bay Area, started working on cryptography protocols like pretty good privacy to allow anonymous communication, private communication. And there was a tension right from the beginning between this desire for privacy that cypherpunks had in their communication and in their financial transactions and the role of government in trying to supervise systems and make sure bad actors are not engaging in bad things. And a lot of what you hear about today in the blockchain world, I think, goes back to this fundamental tension, privacy versus anonymity versus security. You know, how do we reconcile these different pieces?
Thank you. So you mentioned, you know, the three principles behind the blockchain technology, and if I may just referring back to the birth of Bitcoin and why I would agree, well, I hope you would agree with me, you know, why Bitcoin has not really reached in our everyday life. Why are we still using PayPal, credit cards, in MasterCard or Visa card? Is it because people don't know the concept well enough, or is it because people just don't trust, you know, the concept of Bitcoin? And especially recently, you know, we've seen the value of Bitcoin has gone, you know, from $650 per coin until 3 months ago, which is about 200. So do we have trust in this? And then who is the institution behind that? Maybe I'll pose that question to some of our panelists. You know, who is actually behind this new so-called monitoring system that is underpinned by blockchain technology?
I can take that, I guess. So the answer is nobody and everybody who participates in it. Nobody because there's no government standing behind the currency. So this is the big difference between a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin and a fiat currency like the euro or the dollar. It's not possible to manipulate the value of the currency by buying or selling sovereign bonds or anything like that. It's all cryptographically determined according to the program in advance, how many Bitcoins will be issued and when, and the difficulty of solving the algorithms is automatically adjusted over time. And in the case of Bitcoin, there's a hard cap of how much currency will go into circulation. So it was actually designed to be a deflationary currency. So the value of Bitcoin is based on what people think they can do with it. Which is really, at the end of the day, not so different from our fiat currencies today, which are no longer backed by gold, as they once were. The US dollar is backed by the good faith and credit of the US government. How much good faith and credit you give the US government right now is a big question. So it's really based on supply and demand. And so when you put your faith in Bitcoin, you are trusting the system in a sense that the computer code is solid, that the algorithm is good. But you're also trusting that other people will continue to use it, and that over time the use will grow, and therefore Bitcoin will continue to have value. And if people stop using it, then its value will go to zero.
Right. Okay. So then I have the next question. Then, you know, if Bitcoin is going to take over the world, or the Bitcoin-alike currency is going to take over our world in 20 years, then where does it leave us with, you know, the central governments? For example, you know, Bank of England or the Fed and, you know, the various sort of central banks, and what role do they play?
Central banks and in general are central institutions. This is a big question. The blockchain is an amazing technology. It really allows us to decentralize our political, economic, social life in plenty of ways. And let me say it's quite unpredictable in which ways we will use this technology, because we can make so many things with that. In the end, it will be a matter of a collective choice. Remember, we live in complex systems. What is the difference compared to simple systems? Complex systems are unpredictable because they follow patterns that we don't know at present time. We can use model scenarios, we can imagine future scenarios, but it's always complicated really to make a prediction because such scenarios are based on our current data. So it's an extension of our current data towards the future. Models are useful, but they are not real. So what is going to happen with central institutions in general? We have political institutions, we have financial institutions like banks, we have many stakeholders in society that try to protect their own interests, and it's unpredictable the way we are going to recompose all different interests in society. For sure, the blockchain challenges the central institutions like states and like central banks, but we don't know yet to which extent this is going to happen. The blockchain, consider the blockchain is, let's put it simple, a way to keep in sync database, okay? So it's a kind of robotization of procedures. Certain procedures can be robotized, others can't. For example, our political interactions are complex, and not everything can be put on a blockchain. We have to consider that. Politics stems from ethics. It belongs to the ethic dimension of human beings. So in the end, we need human intervention to make certain decisions. We need moral agents to keep authority in our society, and we also need authority, the ultimate dimension of authority, to be offline. You can't put a nation on the blockchain. So there's a certain level of unpredictability about the future, but we have to reflect on possible limits in the application of the blockchain, especially in politics, I think.
Right. Okay. Bruce, would you have anything to add to that point?
Yeah, I think a comparison could be made back to the internet, right? Did the internet truly change our copyright law? No, it didn't. But what it did was it made the copyright law be challenged in much more ways, just because you could, the speed and the transmission of data went down to zero. Whereas before the internet, things would go around, you'd have to send a book to somewhere around the world if you had to get it there. And so that's what we're going to have with assets now, blockchain. So I just wanted to make a distinction between Bitcoin and blockchain. Blockchain is kind of like the underlying technology construct, and Bitcoin is a specific use case, which is cryptocurrency. What blockchains allow is the digitization of any asset. And so that's the kind of stress that we're going to start seeing when blockchain becomes more adopted in government as well as industry, is that this lag time of getting an asset from A to B digitally will become zero. And then there's going to be a lot of stresses and challenges to the law on how do you manage risk, how do you manage regulation, et cetera, when the time is so compressed.
Thank you. Okay, so we've heard about the background of technology that's called blockchain and the potential applications in the finance world as well as in the political sphere. I don't know if anyone in the audience have any questions at this stage for the panelists. If I can start with Felix.
Felix Werder from Munich. Trying to understand what blockchains are and how they could be used, I was wondering whether, also due to the complexity and the challenges and constraints it might have, whether a certain system like a small country like Denmark or something would be a good test case to pilot such a system. And actually considering that, I was wondering whether it actually needs such a system, or whether in the case, for example, in Egypt, it could be kind of like a parallel infrastructure without the ruling parties actually confirming with it.
Yes. So the Republic of Georgia, for example, has already announced a plan to start registering land title, I believe, on blockchains in partnership with Bitfury, which is one of the larger blockchain companies. So that's a way in which government is working together with the industry to use the technology to provide a state service. The Isle of Man is another such small jurisdiction that's, of course, looking at these things and exploring how to use this. And Luxembourg, Switzerland, et cetera, a lot of places are thinking about this. The UK, where I live, recently rolled out a pilot to deploy, to track welfare payments. so benefits to recipients on a blockchain. Now that's an interesting one, right? Because these are people who are kind of, you know, on the margins economically, and should they be on a public blockchain? You know, again, privacy issues, right? You need to think about the trade-offs of the efficiency gains of using blockchain technology with the risks of, you know, someone's receiving benefits revealed to the wider public. You know, that may not be something everyone wants. Yeah.
Okay.
And what about the parallel of Egypt, for example?
Yes, I mean,
Being introduced before.
sure. So you know, people have talked about the ability to parachute in services like, you know, currency, land registry, notary services through blockchain into places like Egypt, Peru, et cetera, without the government's official endorsement. However, some governments have pushed back on this. Ecuador, Bolivia have made Bitcoin illegal, for example. So that's a bit rare. There aren't too many countries that have done that, but some can push back, and others have attempted to regulate it or minimize the speed at which it could be adopted. So China, for example, has limited the banks in their interaction with blockchain companies, their ability for, you know, Bitcoin exchanges to seamlessly transfer funds back and forth between the traditional financial services system.
I think it's important to make a distinction that there are obvious kind of visible threats that governments can see, and that, you know, so you start trying to manage Bitcoin and put regulations on. One of the things that people may not think is the tangential kind of impacts of blockchain technology, in the sense that many of the countries of the world didn't ever install landlines, right? In the last 20 or 30 years, we've had essentially this cellular network installed in most of Asia and Africa, and they just bypass landlines. And blockchain technologies allow for a rethinking of government. And I'm guessing that most of that innovation starts in some places like Singapore, Estonia, Isle of Man, but that technology essentially can be parachuted into areas where you have young democracies that have the right kind of ethical and moral kind of approach on, let's build a good country. And they, just like they can transplant technology from the Western world directly in and just forget about landlines, they can transplant blockchain technology into their government services and just make it so much more effective. And that's the way that, you know, if we saw how the Asian tigers leapfrogged Japan, China, and then the smaller ones leapfrogged into essentially the 21st century, you can see that happening in other places using this type of technology. And I think that's actually part of the conversation most people have not even thought of.
Right. Any more questions?
Just maybe one question. You have shown some very impressive examples of what could be done, at least some examples of what could be done with blockchain. For me, it would be helpful to understand a little better, how does it look like practically? How do you actually put such a transparent, non-changeable value into the internet? How does it really work practically?
Good question. Yeah, we discussed that this morning, trying to help us to understand from an outsider, what does it mean, the ledger? What does it mean that's a worldwide ledger?
I can try and give, I have a presentation that I give to sort of explain in non-technical terms to people what blockchain is and smart contracts and how it works. Can I bring up my PowerPoint? I have a couple of things I can show. And I often find these discussions really abstract myself, so I try to give concrete examples as well, so I can sink my teeth into something that I have a better idea of how to wrap my mind around. This, unfortunately, I can't do today because I don't have my computer here, but it's very easy actually just to do a live demo of how simple it is to set up a wallet and get a transfer of money using the blockchain without knowing anything about it. You can go to a site like this or myetherwallet.com. If anyone wants to do this afterwards, you can come up to me and I'll send you a little bit of ether. It takes about 30 seconds to sign up, and then it takes about 17 seconds for the money to get into your wallet. Now imagine the power of that in the remittances market as a leapfrog technology, which was just mentioned. If you're trying to send money to Tanzania from the United States, there are about 7 to 10 days and a network of about 6 to 8 intermediaries between the money leaving my bank account in the US and it arriving in someone's bank account on the ground in Tanzania. And the smaller the amount of money you send, the more gets eaten up in transaction fees along the way. So, I'd read a bunch of stuff about how it's, depending on what service you use, whether it's Western Union or MoneyGram or something like that, it's somewhere between 15 to 35%. So I decided to do an experiment on this and just see what happens. If I send myself, I was paid an honorarium of $100 in the US, and I sent it to my German bank account. So this is 2 developed countries. And it was actually $65 that arrived in my German bank account to send 100, so it was actually 35%. And it did take 7 to 10 days. I can do that using Bitcoin or Ether in a matter of minutes, and it costs me seconds. So it doesn't have to go through any of those intermediaries. I cut out the banks completely, and then I just exchange back into the fiat currency that I want to use in whatever country I happen to be in. This is really powerful technology. We have about 2 billion people in the world who are still unbanked, completely outside the formal banking system. Many of them are outside of the banking system because they don't have identity documents, and they can't get bank accounts. But they do have smartphones, or even just 2G or 3G phones. Yeah. So if you build the interface that allows them to use this technology on a 2G or 3G phone, which is possible, then they can participate. And there's actually a company in Kenya doing this, BitPesa. And interestingly, it was started by a really fabulous woman named Elizabeth Rossiello, who wanted to make it possible for remittances to happen using Bitcoin, because she had worked in money in Kenya for a long time and was trying to serve the poor. And she found out, actually, that you can do it, but you run into regulatory problems because her clients couldn't show her their identity documents. So she started out trying to serve the poor, and then over time, her business model has had to shift to serve African entrepreneurs, people who do have identity documents and can get bank accounts, because she couldn't satisfy anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing requirements of the international regulatory authorities. So this is a perfect example of how authority and governance can stand in the way of innovation, and how authority and governance exists on multiple levels. So I already have a bank account. I can do this. I can send myself money back and forth all over the world for nothing, but we can't send money to these people who really need it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Julie. And I think, Marcella, you have
a
point.
I totally agree with what Julie said, absolutely. One of the fantastic applications of blockchain is really the possibility to leapfrog a lot of financial institutions to simplify the financial access to unbanked. I just want to point out one little detail. The market of remittance can be very complicated, and it can change market from market, nation from nation. So you propose the example of Tanzania that is absolutely appropriate, but other markets can be very more complicated, because we can have, for example, added cost related to the first and the last mile of the chain. So in some cases, to use a Bitcoin, for example, for remittance can be actually more expensive, or just pretty much the same of using a traditional bank account. Another thing that I'd like to point out is actually an anthropological factor. Sometimes we can have a difficulty with unbanked people, or people that come from a very poor reality, to let them understand how the technology works is not always so immediate. There's an anthropological factor that is related to the use of technology that must be taken into consideration. We can't be just deterministic and say that just because we have a financial value in the use of Bitcoin, then people will adopt it automatically. So all these factors have to be taken into consideration. And another factor also is important, the volatility of the price. If you're a poor farmer in a third country, you absolutely need to expect a certain value in the transaction. If you have a very illiquid market, this can be absolutely problematic. So case by case, we have to identify the benefits and possible problems related to the use of cryptocurrencies for remittance.
Yeah. Actually, I have an immediate question, which is, so in your example, Julie, how is that different from Transferwise? So is that one next level up than Transferwise, because it's using totally different technology?
Yeah, I mean, it cuts out Transferwise, is what it does, essentially. So you don't have... the money is actually not being sent through an intermediary, a central intermediary, which is Transferwise, and they're cheaper than the banks, but they still take their cut. I think they take about 7 to 10%.
Yeah.
It's a lot cheaper than going through the banking system, but it's still an intermediary that you have to funnel the funds through, and they take their cut. This happens with just, it's a decentralized transaction that just gets broadcast all over the world to everybody who happens to be on the Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever network at the time. And the nodes validate the transaction independently.
Yeah.
And it's really just the processing costs of the electricity that's used in the process of validation that ends up being the transaction cost.
Right.
And that's why it's pennies.
Let me just add to that. This is, you can think of fintech, which is another buzzword, right, as kind of all the technological advances that are being made for our existing traditional financial system. So Transferwise actually uses, existing bank payment rails to move value. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are a separate financial system. They have their own unit of value, the coin, and they have the blockchain ledger, the rails, integrated into a single system. Transferwise is using existing rails and existing currencies, the pound, the dollar, the euro, etc. New currency, new set of rails. That's the difference between blockchain and cryptocurrency and, say, fintech. If that makes sense.
Right. So if I were to summarize, so fintech is sort of the world we're living today, and we're taking a forward-looking view. And what we are talking about just now is the world even further down the line. So we are really looking at 5, 10, 20 years in the future. So I think that actually brings back to another point which we discussed this morning. So, everything that can be digitized will be digitized. That's what Eric Schmidt famously saying last year at the NOAA conference. And so if we think about, what keeps our society functioning and what really keeps, everyone feel secure, everyone have their legal rights and, democratic rights, obviously government plays a very, very important role. And I think, alongside Bitcoins, and we also seen the rise of BitNation. So I'm not sure how many, audience here today really understand what is BitNation and what is the significance of that. And does that actually pose a threat to the central governance?
Yes, it's absolutely a threat to the way we conceive politics, to the way we conceive democracy and authority. And the idea of BitNation in general, the idea of crypto-anarchism, because this is what it is, crypto-anarchism, is to use the blockchain to destabilize, to disrupt the current political institutions and also the way we conceive democracy. This idea creates problems both at political and technical level. At political level, they assume that if we use a peer-to-peer network, if we use a distributed ledger like the blockchain, we will have a more democratic society than using public institutions elected through universal suffrage. But this perspective is quite questionable because, first of all, we have a problem of equality between participants in a network, in a peer-to-peer network. Consider that in general, all kinds of collaborative networks, they never have a completely distributed authority. There are always clusters of power, clusters of interest that try to prevail on each other. And this is especially true when you use technology as a big political mediator between participants, because inequalities are hidden in the technology itself. And this also applies to the blockchain. So we have clusters of power, we have clusters of interest. This idea of a completely distributed authority that floats freely in the network risk to be illusory. So what we have actually is the risk to build a technocracy where people with higher capacity to take decisions with codes or to assess the code and to program have much more knowledge and political power than the normal citizen, the average citizen. Mm-hmm. The blockchain is based on algorithms, but algorithms are not politically neutral entities. They are human artifacts. They are human beings behind. So with the blockchain, we have a reduction of human intervention, but still there are people, core developers, and in general, computer experts that have much higher access to this technology. This creates inequality. Another thing that creates inequality is the fact that these networks are profit-oriented. They follow market rules. Markets are natural producers of inequalities. Nothing wrong with that in the sense that we know this is the function of markets. But then we need mechanisms in society to compensate these inequalities. And we don't have that in the blockchain. So we have a problem of inequality, a problem of accessibility and inclusiveness. So what happens when I use this kind of open blockchains to build notary services, to build public service, it risks to be a technocratic system. Can really a blockchain replace political authority? Can really replace public institutions elected through universal suffrage? It risks to be just a system that is open only to a small part of society, an elitist system. So we have to consider all these things when we want to use open blockchains for this kind of services. BitNation now, their proposal is to use the Bitcoin ledger to store notaries' global services, but this creates political problems, as we said, and also technical problems. It's still an immature technology. We have a problem of scalability, for example. When the data grow and grow, comes the day they are not manageable anymore. And the general security of the network is still insufficient, and so on. So,
yeah.
If I could just jump in on that point, I actually, I'm a huge fan of experiments like BitNation. I think they're incredibly productive for our society. And it's also, I mean, it's one of the things that I love about working in this space right now. You have a bunch of 20-somethings running around thinking up crazy ideas and just throwing them out there and trying to see what sticks. And some of it is sticking, actually. And what BitNation shows us is that there is, and we've seen this with Brexit as well, we see this with Donald Trump in my own country, there is a lot of general disillusionment with government. And when large numbers of people become disillusioned with government, they start to look for other alternatives to government. And blockchain gives people alternatives in some senses. They can get around the banking system. Maybe they can get around the central banks. Maybe they can get around some types of identity management requirements with government tracking who you are and what you do and how you spend your money and who you hang out with and all this stuff. You know, the average American in the United States, there are 4 data companies that are metadata companies that are the people that sell up those, help serve up those ads on Google that target exactly what you're doing and know, somehow seem to always know exactly what you want to buy at that moment in time. The average person has 60,000 pieces of unique data. On each individual in the United States, there are 60,000 pieces of unique data. And not everyone wants to have that kind of data concentrated in the hands of private companies they don't know about or governments they don't trust. And really, you know, BitNation is sort of an experiment in people who are trapped behind nation-state borders, wanting to vote with their feet. And they can't vote with their feet because they can't physically leave their country. They can't get citizenship somewhere else. So they're trying to see what parts of my daily life can I detach from my physical territory and conduct somehow without the barriers that my nation state has imposed on me that I don't like. And this really forces countries to say, okay, does it make sense what we're doing? Does it make sense? And I think those are very productive questions to ask.
Yeah. I think maybe we just pause there. Yeah, I see there are a couple burning questions in the audience. Please.
My question actually touches on what you just mentioned about the disillusionment of perhaps the public in the present system. But what I'm trying to wrap my head around is understanding how blockchain can be deployed at the same time without the consensus of the government. Touching on what you mentioned in the keynote speak, you talked about IP assets. So how is that supposed to function? If someone says, okay, well, I have protected patents, and somebody is infringing on my patent, and you say, okay, well, you register it in blockchain system, well, how is that going? Is that running on a parallel track? Can you still then say, well, it's being infringed in the present US patent system? Or how is that going to function?
Yeah, I mean, there really are 2 different ways to do that in the blockchain world. The one suggestion is let's just put the patents on the blockchain. And that makes it maybe more efficient because everyone can see them, and there's a general record, and you don't have to go to the US Patent Office, or the European Patent Office, and the Japanese Patent Office, and whatever. It just is a little bit more efficient to have a global registry, essentially. That's not terribly, it's not terribly different from our current system. It's just a little bit more efficient way of registering patents. and making them more accessible. The other thing that you can do, though, with respect to intellectual property, and I think this is what Bruce was mentioning in his opening remarks, is you can do something else entirely. Rather than getting a patent and then trying to recoup the value of your innovation over the patent period, the 20 years that are protected or whatever, by having to go around enforcing that patent, you only selectively reveal your intellectual property to people who contract with you directly on the blockchain and send you money for it. So you're only in tiny little pieces here and there, and that allows you to sell your intellectual property much more cheaply, because for each individual use, you just reveal it to that one person. And if you do that millions of times or billions of times, you can still make a lot of money out of it and recoup the investment in your intellectual property. So it's a different model of intellectual property management.
Any further questions from the audience? Okay,
yeah. First of all, thank you to the organizers. A big applause to put together such a sophisticated and diverse panel. So a big applause for the organizers, please. But coming to my actual question, like being from Germany, I might be culturally inclined to focus more on the risk of a given technology than on the chances it might bear. So my question is, does blockchain technology bear inherent security? Or can it be hacked? Can it be manipulated? Can it be destroyed? And if so, who would be liable for that?
Yeah. Yes, it can, is the short answer. So inherent in any proof-of-work-based system, proof-of-work is a kind of security mechanism. It's how the data is secured and is, authentic on a blockchain. No, there's not enough time to really explain how proof-of-work works, but there's a built-in inherent vulnerability to any proof-of-work-based system, which is that if 50% of the computing power that runs the network decides to hack the system, it can. So if there's a bad actor, a dishonest person or collection of persons who have 50% of the network, they can alter the truth of the blockchain.
51, yeah, slightly more than half. Yeah.
And the real number is actually in the low 30%. You can actually launch a successful attack, it's been shown, with less than 50%. So that's one issue. So that's why having a very large number of computers and a lot of computing power like Bitcoin and Ethereum and a few others have is really important to creating security. And then there's the question of, okay, why would someone want to engage in this 50% attack? That's what it's called. Because if they were to acquire all the equipment necessary to do this, and then they attack the network, the value of Bitcoin or Ether would drop and reduce the value of their investment. But maybe a hacker doesn't care about money and just wants to do it to, earn reputation points. Or maybe they're able to hijack what are called mining pools to launch such an attack. So there are some security issues.
I think there's two ways to look at risks in the blockchain space. Number one is the technology risk, and number two is kind of the society risk. And technology risk, Garrick talked a little bit about. It's fundamentally just code, and any code can be hacked. Technology constantly advances, so if the technology gets more powerful, you're going to be able to find different vulnerabilities by applying different techniques. And so generally in the systems that we have in our world, of course, is we have the law. The law is essentially this construct we built up over hundreds of years to protect in the mechanic systems that we built out in the world. And, Bitcoin was started out as kind of a lawless area that tried to distance itself from government, from authority, and all these things. And, we talked about this. One of the things that we actually don't, well, I'll say for me, I don't believe that blockchains can be detached from the law. There has to be some interface point to people and the real world, and that's where law comes in. So there's always room for lawyers, and there's room for government, and there's room for enforcement, right? The thing that blockchain does is it changes the risk to, right now if you hack a bank, that's actually real, it's not easy, but it's possible. We've seen that, right? Mm-hmm. That bank takes the loss. If you're able to hack blockchain or one network that includes all the banks, it's a different risk because you can take down the entire system. It's a higher systemic risk problem because more value is at stake. You know, if you as an individual, your data gets hacked, you bear that risk, and then we have to find some way to legally solve it. And with the technology, as we move more towards these technological systems, the entire system may become more secure. That's kind of the whole point of this blockchain, but the attack vectors are much more powerful.
Let me add something about the security, because it's absolutely a big problem. One problem related to Bitcoin, for example, is the poor cryptography that Bitcoin is based on. Consider that Bitcoin is developed around algorithms that were developed in the end of the 70s. They are, for example, they are not quantum resistant. Mm-hmm. That means the possible emergence of quantum computers, and is absolutely likely, can disrupt this kind of blockchain at any time. That's why I think it's a bit an immature technology to build a lot of services on a top on, because it's not safe enough. Another problem is still related to security in a sense, because we may lack proper preservation of data in the long terms. This kind of network are, as I said, based on market rules, and if the blockchain, this kind of blockchain, becomes not profitable anymore, there's no interest in society to keep this data, so we actually don't know if the data we store in the blockchain will be preserved in 1 year, 2, or 5. So it's a problem related also to the security of our data.
Yeah, but also the follow-on question is, you know, when let's assume in a perfect world where everyone is able to input their information into this worldwide ledger, as Bruce was mentioning earlier, then in the end of the day, who actually owns this whole pool of data? What happens if it disappears? And, you know, is there certain rules about how you should enter those data and who's going to organize them? I mean, those are the kind of real questions that we need to answer if we really want to, you know, embrace the world of blockchain technology.
We need absolutely this kind of security, at least the preservation of long-term, in the long term of data. We can have it only if we use so-called permissioned ledgers, because we reintroduce the centralization for security and for preservation of data. But open blockchains like Bitcoin at the moment don't give any guarantee about what will happen in the long term.
For me, I think the question that I try to ask myself when I'm evaluating risk questions is doing this on a blockchain more or less risky than doing it in our current environment? And I think it's very important to keep that comparison in mind, because there's no such thing as risk-free money. There's no such thing as risk-free banking. There's no such thing as risk-free securities exchanges. All of this stuff entails risk. And the question that we have to ask ourselves when we ask ourselves, should we put this on a blockchain, or should we use blockchain technologies to facilitate this particular type of transaction? The question that we ask is it more or less risky than what we already have? The example that you mentioned about identity management and data protection is a question about consumer protection. And if consumers don't understand what happens to their data when it's out on a blockchain, then you have real issues that you have to answer. And that usually happens in some sort of a regulatory or government or policy lawmaking fashion. But let's be honest with ourselves. Most consumers have no idea what's happening with their data on the internet. So, I mean, blockchain is not that different a problem than the problem that we already know. It has different... there are different technologies that can be used to facilitate data protection on a blockchain as opposed to on the internet. But the fundamental problem remains the same. And we have to ask ourselves, is it a good idea to put certain types of data on a blockchain, just as we have to ask ourselves, is it a good idea if I post this particular thing to Facebook?
Right.
Yeah. I think the only solution here is to choose the right blockchain, the right ledger with certain specific technical feature for the right kind of data. So we should avoid multi-purpose blockchains for very sensitive data like government services, for example. This can be a first differentiation in the use of the blockchain. The blockchain is a buzzword, is a very wide concept, but then we have to understand it's a kind of technology that can and should be designed according to the use we want to do of that, and according to the kind of data that we are dealing with. Public data are different than private data, and so on. So use the right ledger for a specific kind of data.
Right. Yeah.
The question goes the examples you mentioned regarding sort of manipulation of the value it sounded a bit like illegal, like hacking and stuff. But I was not sure whether I understood you correctly when you mentioned these algorithms, and there are means of having impact or influence on these algorithms. Are they still subject of change? And might it be that governments can say, okay, let's say very powerful governments, they say, okay, we want to change these algorithms? Or what means would have a government on a sort of, like they do have at the moment, to manipulate their currency value? Do they have any chance to manipulate the value of the Bitcoin? I'd say legal means?
The value of Bitcoin is that it essentially is global, right? So for a government to enforce that type of change, they would have to get, just like it takes 51% of the network to take it down, you also need 51% of the network to agree to change it. Or, actually, no, you actually don't need that. You can actually, different people can choose different philosophies, right? Sorry, maybe that's not explaining myself very well. If you want to change the entire system at once, you would have to get pretty much everybody to agree, and then everybody kind of moves over to that new system. It's kind of like upgrading the code. And that was what Bitcoin was designed to stop from governments doing. Okay? So it's a global system that you have to get everybody to agree.
Yeah, maybe I can answer or say something about this. So at the beginning, I mentioned that Bitcoin was really designed to be decentralized, right? But that term needs some, I think, explanation. I mean, supposedly over 50% of all the computing power that's running the Bitcoin network, the Ethereum network, is inside the Great Firewall of China. Okay, so China today dominates the network in terms of computing power. Okay, so think about that. What does that mean?
Scary.
Well, it's interesting, right? It makes this really interesting potentially to Chinese policymakers who may want to use this technology to do things like assume more control of the next generation internet by kind of trying to weaken the U.S.'s grip on DNS, for example, by running a new DNS system on the Bitcoin network or the Ethereum network, for example.
Probably a lot of people don't know what DNS is.
Yeah. It gets complicated. This is, but maybe also China, for example, and this is pure speculation. Okay, this is a pure conjecture. I'm not predicting this is going to happen, but China, as we know, is trying to become and is really a global financial superpower. Has been buying a lot of gold to increase its reserve assets. It's having a hard time catching up to the United States and gold reserves, let alone Italy. Maybe it decides that it wants to create a new reserve asset. Maybe the fact that over half of the Bitcoin network or the Ethereum networks inside the Great Firewall of China makes Bitcoin or Ether an attractive reserve asset and certainly a lot cheaper to acquire than gold. So nation states could come to want to influence and change some of the protocol rules based on their priorities, especially if they're in a strong position to do so. That's a possibility.
So are we, venturing into the territory of cyber attack then? Because is that part of the discussion? Because, well, leaving, personal emotional aside, I'm Chinese, so, but, which is fine. I see what my country is doing. Something is really amazing happening there, but also scary things. But, as I said, leaving personal emotion aside, but imagine the world of, let's say 20 years down the line, China could easily launch an attack on, the other financial system because, as you said, they are trying to get into the code of everything. But take a step back. If we are saying, the worldwide ledger is so public, it's so open, the code itself is a law, then, does this question even exist? Which country has the power, has the key to all this data, and has the ultimate authority?
I think it's really important to mention and make clear that there's hundreds of different blockchains today, and there's all sorts of variation taking place in experimentation. The banks, for example, are worried about public blockchains like Bitcoin and Ethereum and who's really mining, or running the computers, and therefore are looking at private blockchains, these permission blockchains, right, that are more limited. They control who actually has access to the network. A real question is are we going to have in the future lots and lots of blockchains? And if so, how are they going to communicate with each other? How's the interoperability going to work between these hundreds of different blockchains? Or are we going to have, like the internet, kind of one internet, in essence, with common protocols that govern the internet? I think that's a really important question, but it's too early to tell. For now, we're going to have lots of different blockchains. And as we've discussed, I think people are picking different models of blockchain based on their priorities and requirements.
I think when we are dealing with cyber attacks and so on, it's very important to keep in mind that there's never a good solution to store everything on a single system. That they are to build this big global ledger where you store all transactions. It's never very good on the security point of view. It's like putting all your eggs in the same basket. So we should avoid this kind of systemic risk and develop an ecosystem that is really differentiated. So we have to decentralize. Even inside the logic of decentralization, we should avoid to centralize everything on a one single global ledger, I think.
Nice.
Can you help me understanding one thing? The main character of a currency is that we believe in its value. So how does it work with Bitcoin, where you mentioned it, the value is dramatically changing all the time. So I think I know what the value of a euro is, or a US dollar, Swiss franc, but what about the Bitcoin?
I love this question. Can I handle this question? Please. This is one of my favorite questions. So Bitcoin, there's only 21 million Bitcoins that will ever exist, unless that rule is changed. But right now, that's the rule. So it's scarce, kind of like gold. And it's useful for sending money across borders, as Julie talked about. So that scarcity and that utility, that usefulness, are what give it its value based on demand, based on the fact people want it to do things with it. But if that demand vanishes, then the value will plummet. All right? The other important thing to understand about the difference between Bitcoin and the euro is there's no central bank standing behind Bitcoin that can buy Bitcoin if the price plummets. So if the price of the euro plummets, the European Central Bank can borrow dollars from the New York Federal Reserve, sell those dollars for euros to keep the value of the euro up. Alternatively, the European Central Bank can print as many euros as it wants to keep the value from going too high, like the Swiss National Bank did a few years ago, right, when the franc was appreciating. So that's how a central bank can help kind of keep a national currency within a certain band. There's nothing like that with Bitcoin. Having said that, over the last 12 months, is Bitcoin a better store of value than the euro or the dollar? Well, on the one hand, Bitcoin is 5 to 8 times more volatile on a 30-month kind of basis than the euro or the dollar. You know, the fluctuation is going like this compared to the euro or dollar like this. But Bitcoin has increased in value by over 150% over the last 12 months. So you tell me, is it a better store of value because it's increasing in value, or is it a worse store of value because it's so volatile? It depends on your perspective and how you're using it.
It also just depends on your outside options as well. If you're in Zimbabwe, Bitcoin's great. if you're in the US or in the European Union, it's maybe not as attractive. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the interesting things with cryptocurrencies is it actually forced economists, technologists, and general society to ask the question, what is money? No. Like, money is a construct of our imagination. When Garrick talks about the European Central Bank standing behind the euro, who stands behind the European Central Bank? Mm-hmm. It's the trust that the world and Europeans have in their institution. That's all it is. That's the fundamental backing of any currency. It's a construct. It's a pure figment of imagination in a sense. It's backed by real industrial production and all this sort of stuff, economic value. But the unit of measure, which is the euro, could easily be a different type of currency, a cryptocurrency, a digital currency, or US dollar, right? And other countries use different currencies, even though that's not their native currency. There's so many countries in the world that use the US dollar just because they trust it.
Yes, it's very interesting what you said. I totally agree with Bruce when he said one of the best things cryptocurrencies are doing is forcing us to really think what money is. And actually, the concept of money can be really counterintuitive compared to what the average person may think. It is actually something that doesn't necessarily need to have intrinsic value. Actually, money is just a memory of a transaction from A to B. So in the end, it can be really robotized. It can be really transformed in just a ledger. So we keep the memory of what happened. And this is very challenging for us because since our childhood, we think about money in a very incorrect way because we have a coin in our hand and we think we have to hold it. It means something. A kid doesn't know that a coin is actually nothing. It's a promise of payment. So I think it's a mental pattern that we are born with. And when we grow up, we really struggle to reconsider what money is. And the cryptocurrencies are pushing up to really have a more mature approach also to our sense of economy and money.
I like your point that actually I think our next panel can venture into the intersection between technology and philosophy, like, you know, a lot of the definition we're taking for granted and how it's going to be changed so fundamentally because the new technology we keep inventing. I think I saw a couple of questions. Julius?
Yeah, so one question, maybe a little bit back to the basics again, because maybe I missed it at the beginning. Who sets up a ledger, and can anyone create a blockchain? Can I go home and create a ledger or a blockchain? Who decides whether he wants to join my blockchain or my ledger? Are these ledgers or blockchains being maintained over time? Do they stop? Could you give a bit more technical detail around, to the extent that we can understand it, of how the infrastructure works?
Yeah, the blockchains are open source, which means the code is completely viewable, accessible, and it can be tested by anybody. So anybody in this room can set up their own blockchain if they wanted to. You have this network concept called Metcalfe's law, where every additional person you get, the more powerful that network becomes, and the most powerful network in the world is Bitcoin right now. But if you have something that's quite compelling and unique, maybe let's call it, Andy coin, and you have something that people really want, then that could itself become kind of a unit and store of value. I mean, I'd just like to circle quickly back into what that means when we talked about the construct of money and stuff, this abstraction of a unit of store of value. It circles back to the keynote. When we think about currency, that's a great use case because we all can relate to it. Think about this with any type of asset, right? Like this is the power of it. Bitcoin is kind of a level above blockchain, and we all understand that. At least we think we do. And then you go down to a level and just say any asset. So let's say like a plane ticket could be a currency if you can transfer this, like any asset, a stock certificate, your intellectual property, your identity. All of these are in certain ways currencies, a store of value that we can now transmit electronically around the world at a price that's not interdictable by any government. And to get back to your point then, it's all about what type of asset are you trying to put onto a blockchain that determines how the blockchain is architected. And the first one was, of course, Bitcoin, and now everybody has forked it and created kind of new versions of it. There's probably 300-400 different types of cryptocurrencies. And then now industry, insurance companies, banks, they're looking at taking the concepts of Bitcoin and blockchain and creating their own kind of blockchains that are more private in access to serve their needs, whether it's payment remittances or what have you. And so that's how it's kind of propagated through the systems. So anybody can set this stuff up.
Any more questions from the audience?
Can I just add on to that, though, first, that it's true that it's open source, and technically, in principle, anyone could set it up, but you need a certain level of technical acumen to do it, right? You need to be able to code, you have to understand, and depending on which cryptocurrency you're talking about, Solidity is a mess. There are probably only 100 people in the world who are really proficient Solidity coders, which is the language that's used to program the Ethereum blockchain. Anybody can do it. And it's actually quite easy to set up a node, what's called a node on your own computer, which just replicates a copy of the blockchain of your choice so that you can sort of keep tabs on what's going on. There are relatively decent user interfaces for that now. I have an Ethereum node on my MacBook. That's fine. But to do the actual coding, that takes quite a high degree of technical competence and knowledge of cryptography a little bit. You have to understand how it's working and what happens there. And the way that the community has managed that is that there are foundations and groups of core developers who are sort of self-appointed stewards of the network. In the same way that you have Linux Foundation and we have an Ethereum Foundation, there's Bitcoin core development team, and they sort of decide together on improvements to the code and then suggest it to the community that is using the network. And if more than half of the community that's using the network likes the changes and adopts them, then it gets implemented in the code from there on. So that's sort of in layman's terms how it works.
I would like to get back to the question of Transferwise and the comparison with the Transferwise case. You said that with Bitcoin or a cryptocurrency in general, you can cut out the middleman. And I would argue against that because in the end, you need somebody to help you get into the system, get your fiat money. Let's say you're sending US dollar to the Eurozone. You need somebody to exchange the US dollar into Bitcoin for you and then exchange the Bitcoin into the euro for you. Just from the question of efficiency, pure efficiency, I would say it's much easier to directly transfer or directly exchange US dollar into euro without having this crazy, wildly fluctuating currency in between, right? So if I start a business, I just say, okay, I have one business in the US and one in the Europe, and they directly exchange money, just like Transferwise does, right? But now you have two entities taking their own cuts. How can this be more efficient?
Yeah, I can. I mean, I think you have to understand the correspondent banking network, I think, to understand how why Bitcoin can be more efficient. In particular, you need to also think about it globally, too, in terms of what countries you're trying to send money to. I think, Julie made a good example that, it's a lot harder to get money to Africa, for example. You can't even get money from the United States to a place like Somalia, for example, because the banks are engaging in de-risking. It's just too risky to be involved in trying to, watch money laundering to Somalia. So there's no way you can get money there. But the correspondent banking network is very, very archaic. There's windows of time when you can send money, from 9 a.m. bankers' hours to 4 p.m., for example, Monday through Friday. So what if you're not, 2% of all of these transactions apparently fail to be completed for various reasons. The fees, So, somebody who wants to send money from California to England to their granddaughter, I'm not going to name any names, my mother, she doesn't even have to know she's using Bitcoin based on the way a certain app is developed, all right? She just uses dollars to convert to pounds instantaneously for very low fees, basically zero, and she doesn't even know she's using Bitcoin. So it's much faster and cheaper than any other system, even in 2 advanced countries.
And the answer is you actually only need one. You need an exchange, but you can use the same exchange for your different currencies. So you could just open up an account with an exchange, and the exchange does it for you vis-a-vis fiat currencies and whatever cryptocurrency you're using. And because it happens within seconds, you don't actually bear a lot of risk. You have a few seconds worth of risk. And then you've cashed out of your cryptocurrency back into whatever your fiat was on the other end.
So think about like email. Email is run, using a protocol, SMTP, that no one really understands who uses email, but it works. They don't need to know how the technical underpinnings of email work to send a message from one person to another. The same way my mother doesn't need to know how blockchains work to send dollars into sterling from California to England.
If I may follow up on that, I mean, you made 2 points, right? The first one is that you can bypass regulation. You mentioned money laundering and so on. So
No. This particular entity is regulated, highly regulated.
It's legal.
I think, maybe we just use one example. We're talking about sending money from, from Germany to Singapore, to China, right? Both countries has quite robust financial system. Transferwise does transfer money from China to Germany or Germany to China. Now let's imagine we are using the blockchain technology. How is that going to be different than, Transferwise? Let's take that as an example.
So everyone know how Transferwise works? No? Okay. So Transferwise kind of, basically instead of sending money across borders, although they have to do this, they kind of send money within their border. So for example, if someone needs pounds, they send it from one account to another, and that's how they avoid the cross-border fees, basically. That's their kind of innovation. They've created a platform to transfer money on that platform that kind of bypasses the traditional correspondent banks where you pay high fees and it's slow, et cetera. So Bitcoin is just a whole new network. It's a new payment rail, all right, with a new unit of value to move value from one place to another. You could think of it as like an upgraded computer system that runs more efficiently and is lower cost than, say, the old legacy system. And that's why it's cheaper, faster, and arguably better.
If I could just bring in a couple of other examples so we can also think beyond the question of just simple money payments. Yeah. You can also think of other types of intermediaries like stock exchanges. You can do instant trading of stock exchanges in a decentralized network without, or stocks, bonds, commodities, whatever, without having to have an exchange. And then you can eliminate things like high-frequency trading. You have all these firms that sit in New Jersey. Why? Because New Jersey is physically closer to Wall Street when you run a big data cable underneath the water as opposed to through Manhattan, and they have microseconds faster closing of trades, and therefore they make more money than the firm that's 200 meters further away. And there's been this big crazy competition to do things like this, to sort of game the system to be the fastest one to clear or match up buyers and sellers in the stock market. If you do that in a decentralized way, it's not going through a central, you don't have to physically be the closest one to New Jersey or to Wall Street. You can just be whoever, wherever, and as soon as 51% of the network has confirmed the transaction between the buyer and seller, then you're on your way. And that's also being experimented with by a number of companies who are working on securities, trading, commercial papers, letters of credit, all kinds of other trade financing. All this paperwork that you have to fill out that shows that I produced this good in Vietnam so that I can get a particular tariff regime when I sell it into the United States, to show that it was from Vietnam and not from Cambodia or China or whatever, which have different trade deals with the United States. So there are lots of different applications that we could think about. Each of them has their own possible advantages and possible risks that they introduce, but it is much broader than just money transfer.
Right, okay. Actually, that's a very nice beginning of what I was going to come to. So we spoke about, blockchain applicability in the financial world and in the political sphere. Now, Bruce, you also mentioned in your opening speech, there are many, many, many more areas that this technology is going to make such a difference. So if I look at our audience today, obviously we come from very, very different backgrounds. We have lawyers here, we have bankers, we have entrepreneurs, and we have academics, and even people in the field of creative industry. So maybe give us a few flavor of how the blockchain technology is going to change that. Do we still need human beings to do those jobs, or is computer going to take over everything?
Well, blockchains allow for an automation of processes in a much stronger way, and the transmittal of those assets. It essentially gets rid of many back office functions. The whole purpose of back office function is to kind of like check if things match, if they add up, and all this kind of stuff. And most of those functions you can essentially digitize. It's a further advancement of computerization. So we're talking millions and millions of bank jobs at risk. One of the ideas that we had thought of was that perhaps the legal profession would also be at risk, but the more I look at blockchains, the more I realize that there's probably more work for a legal profession. So that's good news for some of you in the audience. Some of the other use cases, right, like global intellectual property, having that global registry, it's a very mundane thing, but it can actually be very powerful. If you can make a claim of authorship for your work, your patent, your idea, that the globe can see, then you're no longer limited to the Copyright Office in the US or to the EU or what have you. That's one really good use case. Another use case is supply chain. So, it was touched on trade finance. We did a proof of concept for the diamond industry. And we found that there is, in today's world, probably 15 attack vectors where people can introduce fraud, put fake diamonds into the supply chain, cheat people, all this kind of stuff. And we tested one of them. And we found that in one marketplace in America, we found $1 billion worth of fraud, and in one attack vector. So it's an $80 billion industry per year, and we found, using artificial intelligence, that's kind of some of the stuff we do in the background. But we found just $1 billion a year waiting, and we can identify every single instance of that fraud. So we handed this back to the company who's working with the insurance companies and the diamond industry to take that fraud out. And when you can do that, when you can have this kind of perfect chain of provenance, you can put trade financing on it. Because currently there's only 2 banks in the world who take the risk of financing from the mine all the way to when it reaches your finger or to the customer, diamond industry. And so this opens up huge opportunities for the banking and insurance world to finance things that weren't financeable before, or insure things that weren't insurable before. Much of this hasn't been really talked about in the Bitcoin kind of space, but in the areas that I look at in the blockchain space, I work only with enterprise. I work with supply chain companies, manufacturers, banks, trading houses. And there's a lot of use cases, but it's going to take a while for it to really kind of touch us in a personal way that we truly kind of can understand how it works.
Right. I'm just conscious of time. Maybe before we wrap up, is there any other questions that is still in the audience that you would love to ask at this moment in time? No? Okay. Please, over to you, Gary.
I don't think we've talked about smart contracts yet, have we?
Not yet.
If
we take 2 minutes? Yes, we can do that.
I mean, this is one of the killer apps of blockchains. Now, smart contracts could have arguably been developed prior to blockchains. You don't need a blockchain to do smart contracts, but the financial services system didn't develop the idea of a smart contract. What is a smart contract? Briefly, for those who don't know. So imagine you have a dog, and you have a dog walker who comes to your house to pick up the dog. The dog has a GPS chip around its neck, walks the dog the agreed upon route, and once the walk is completed, the chip sends a signal to the network confirming the agreed upon route has been completed, and the smart contract issues payment to the dog walker. So it's basically automation. It's a way to automate payments. So think about trade finance, think about GPS chips on shipping containers, all right? A shipping container going from point A to point B, and that, completion of that trip being registered on a network, and then capital being freed up rather than having a person in the middle of England processing some kind of paper bill like is currently done. Really, really powerful use of blockchain technology to enable automation of business processes. That's, I think, something that could be hugely powerful across a lot of different industries.
If I could just jump in on that, I completely agree. And one of the things that's really interesting and important about smart contracts is that you can imagine doing just about anything with them. And that's exciting and also dangerous. And smart contracts can also be programmed. This brings it back to your question about do we not need humans anymore? They can also be programmed to interact out there in cyberspace with other smart contracts. If condition A happens, then take action B. If condition Y happens, then take action Z, that sort of thing, without any further intervention from a human. And the more complex they get, these sort of if-then interaction kinds of scenarios, you can build entire organizations that are just sets of contracts, essentially. And eventually, something's going to happen that you didn't anticipate when you wrote the code. And we need to have fallback mechanisms in place when those things happen to figure out how does the human dimension intervene again into the system if something just really unanticipated and crazy happens. ISIS starts using this organization to do whatever. And there are lots of different various types of scenarios, and we have seen some examples of them recently in some crazy experiments that have been going on in crowdfunding in the blockchain space. But this really shows that you do need to have human governance solutions. And at some point, you have to have human authority. And Bruce mentioned law, and that's kind of our default fallback mechanism. But in some sense, whether it's law or whether you call it government, you need to have some kind of social consensus mechanisms around how blockchain technologies are used.
I see. And Marcella, would you have one last point before we wrap up?
Well, the last point is, like Julie just said, in the end, it's just a matter of making a collective choice, and we will learn by doing about this technology, what we can do, and which are the limits. We have to optimize our choices according also to social, political, economic development. We are at a very early stage of this technology, and we are all engaged in understanding possible application, and as I said, it's pretty much learn by doing that we will proceed.
Yeah. Great. Okay. I think I'm slightly over 1 minute over 1 o'clock. So if you could join me in thanking our panelists today in giving us such a thought-provoking discussion.